Before Paradox Interactive was a massive publicly listed strategy game corporation, they were a small struggling Swedish game company making rather niche strategy games. Which their first big one, the one that they gambled everything on, was Europa Universalis. But the release of Europa Universalis was not the success that they had hoped for because the company struggled to even make payroll. As explained by game director Johan Andersson to PC Gamer, this is due to the fact that the publisher for Europa Universalis only had access to sell their games in Germany, at least in the first year of release, severely limiting their reach and sales of the first game. And in the early days, not getting paid was a real thing they faced, as sales depended also on them printing a number of copies which cost money, and if they couldn't sell enough copies, payments could get delayed. Your revenue depended on other parties handing you cash, and other parties have a knack of not parting with their money so easily. So Europa Universalis 2 was a desperate attempt to earn a bigger profit so that everyone can get paid. They took under a year to develop it, and in 2001, a year after the release of Europa Universalis, the game was out of the door. I remember Johan Andersson mentioning that he felt relief they weren't crucified for EU2 since it was technically Europa Universalis++, and not like a big new sequel on a whole new improved engine, more of an iterative improvement than a big sequel. They were stretching the definition of a sequel with Europa Universalis 2 for sure. But it was clearly evident they needed to do this, and since the release of the first Europa Universalis, they've gotten some feedback, valuable feedback, including they needed to make any nation playable, which was interestingly done by a mod for Europa Universalis, and guess this, created by Henrik Vervius, who was later hired to work on Europa Universalis 2, and he went on to lead the team creating Crusader Kings 3 and Stellaris, and is the chief creative officer of Paradox Interactive. A pretty cool gig for a modder. But Europa Universalis 2 was planned out very quickly, and they had to get it out before Christmas into the US market to maximize its sales potential. Beyond the play any nation you want, Europa Universalis 2 also added cultures, more religion, which believe it or not, they only had like Christianity and Islam in the first game, and yet more sliders. The domestic policy slider was a great addition though, since it gave players the ability to somewhat direct the path of their nation. You've always felt like there's very limited things you could do to your nation to sort of make it the sort of nation you wanted, and EU2 solved this to a certain degree. Although they severely limited this to like only once in a decade opportunity that enabled you to shift the sliders. Europa Universalis 2 was undoubtedly the complete, more complex version of Europa Universalis, and it just made the first version, Europa Universalis, an outdated version. And quite frankly, I would call it a deprecated version, even though you can still purchase it, which is why I mentioned in my previous video where I talked about Europa Universalis that EU2 is the game you should be playing if you want to check out the classic Europa Universalis games. We can't actually tell the sales figures that Europa Universalis 2 got, since it was pretty much physical sales that aren't publicly available today, and probably lots of people pirating the game as well, but that didn't matter because we know that they went on to make more grand strategy games to focus on different time periods with the EU2 engine, like a medieval one with Crusader Kings, then they went with World War II with Hearts of Iron, a Victorian era one with Victoria, or even Roman antiquity with Europa Universalis Rome. So yeah, I'm pretty sure Europa Universalis 2 was a success and allowed Paradox Interactive to thrive and make many more grand strategy game series. It allowed them to become the juggernaut strategy game company they are today. And they are a very different company today. And gone is the feeling of that small, messy development process of a ragtag group of programmers, which you definitely say they were in the early days. Now it's a massive corporation with multiple teams working on multiple games within a corporate company that aims to please their investors with ever growing profits and the constant release of DLCs, to keep the money rolling in. The line always has to be going up. And to some extent, I think this is why Johan Andersson likes to set up at Paradox Tinto in Spain. While not entirely a small dev team, it has that small team vibe. I think he misses that, where they could try out new ideas, sometimes even to the detriment of their games. Don't get me wrong, I don't think Europa Universalis 5 has a small dev team, on the contrary, but I'm talking about the spirit in which it is developed, the work culture of the team working on it to some extent. Game development has changed quite a bit since then. Gone are the days of a bunch of dudes in their garage trying to make something they think is cool. And while this creative indie spirit of game dev still somewhat exists with small teams today, the entire market has changed. It is now easier for anyone to develop a game and release it to the public via various platforms on the internet. But this also means there is a deluge of games released. Thousands of games are released on Steam each month, and this means the margin between what is a success and a failure is very slim. It can be pretty tough to small developers, notwithstanding the quality of the games, of course, if all things are equal. Even if you had a cool small game, it's very hard to predict whether a certain game would become a breakaway success, but that's another video for another day. Anyway, do tell me if you'll be getting Europa Universalis 5 on launch, and what's your favorite Europa Universalis game, or even Paradox Grand Strategy game? Have you played Europa Universalis 2? Tell me in the comments. I did a video on the first Europa Universalis where I explored a game playing England and talked about what made that game special. And yes, I still like the game regardless of how old or outdated it is. Check out that video over here. Thanks for watching and farewell, noble friends.